Hi, it's good to be back with you for week 5 of Sweeter Than Chocolate, Hebrews 11. We've been using Hebrews 11 as a guide to unwrapping the storyline of the Bible and helping us remember the broad picture and the big pieces. So far, the two big events we've seen have been creation and the flood. On Moses' watch, a third big event takes place, and that's the exodus of the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. The major characters we've met in Hebrews 11 have been Abel, who's the son of Adam and Eve, then Enoch and Noah, who both walked with God, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. Last week we started talking about Moses, who's a huge player both in the Old Testament and in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews 11 alone, Moses is the featured character in 7 out of the 40 verses. And I'm not a math person, but that's almost 20% of the chapter. Earlier in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 3, we're told that Moses was faithful in God's house as a servant, but that Christ was faithful as a son. There is no doubt that Moses was a man of great faith, a man of great humility, and a man mightily used of God. But Moses, like you and me, was a human being. And when we look back at the story of Moses in the books of Exodus and Numbers in particular, and when we read the New Testament commentary from the book of Acts, we get a much more rich and textured picture of his life. And we see a man who at times overestimated himself. And at other times, he underestimated himself. Does that sound familiar at all? I mean, have you ever been there? It can be a hard thing for people to get a proper estimate of themselves. Maybe you're right there with Moses right now doing the whole Lord, I so can't talk thing. I cannot teach Sunday school. I cannot teach a Bible study. Maybe that's you. I can sure relate with that. Or maybe you're on the other end of the spectrum, thinking, this world needs some change, and let me tell you how we're going to do it. I've been there too. You know, as human beings, we have a tendency sometimes to think too highly of ourselves, other times to think too lowly of ourselves. Some of us, we tend in one direction, others tend in the other, and a lot of us bounce between the two. We're like a pendulum that swings from one unhealthy point to another opposite and equally unhealthy point. And I think we see this happening in the life of Moses. And I think it's common to people when we take our focus off of God and let it fall back onto ourselves. You know, in Romans 12, it's one of the key passages in the Bible on spiritual gifts. Paul tells us that based on everything God has done for us, our acceptable service of worship is to present our bodies as living and holy sacrifices that are acceptable to God. He goes on to tell us to think rightly about ourselves. In verse 3, he says, "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." Then he jumps right into a teaching segment on spiritual gifts. How we all work together in the body of Christ to do what God has made us to do in the way he has made us to do it. And don't think too highly is the main gist we get here in the Romans passage. But thinking soundly includes not living in fear either, which is what we often do when we think, in a sense, too lowly of ourselves, when we don't acknowledge the power of the Spirit in our lives. In 2 Timothy 1:7, Paul reminds us that God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but he's given us a spirit of power, of love, and here's our word, a sound mind. Here, of course, it's the noun form, sophronimos. In Romans 12, it's the infinitive verb, but it's the same word family. We need to have a proper estimation of ourselves. But that has everything to do with us having a proper estimation of God in our relationship to Him. Now let's get back to Moses. As I said earlier, most of his life, Moses walked with a proper estimation of God and of himself. But we see glimpses, even in him, of straying on this and of missing the mark. The first instance happens when, as the book of Acts tells us, he was approaching the age of 40. Now at this point, he's been raised as a prince of Egypt, and he goes out to visit his Hebrew brethren and ends up killing an Egyptian who's been beating one of his countrymen. He figures the people understand that God is going to use him to deliver them. And honestly, that makes sense from a human standpoint. He's here in the palace. It would make sense that God would use him. It's not that big of a logical leap. But it's Moses' timing and it's Moses' plan. He overestimates his power. He overestimates his popularity. He overestimates his influence with the people. You know, I've often heard it said that if you want to know if you're a leader, you should just look over your shoulder and see if anyone's following you. Well, at this point, even though God had plans for Moses, there was no one back there. He overestimated, and he ended up having to beat it out of Egypt. Have you ever overestimated? I have. You know, sometimes in our zeal for God, we start thinking more about what can I do for him instead of thinking, how can I submit to him? How can I allow him to more easily work through me? Oh, the difference seems so subtle, yet it's profound. In one scenario, I seek to control. And in the other, I am submitting to his control. Overestimating, thinking too highly of ourselves, almost always leads to a whiplash effect, where after a failure, we begin underestimating and devaluing what God has highly valued. And I think we see this in the life of Moses. I find it very interesting that the book of Acts tells us that the young Moses, prior to killing the Egyptian, was a man of power in word and deed. Check it out for yourself. It's in Acts 7:22. It tells us that Moses had been educated, and the Greek word here is paiduo. It's the word for child training. It says he had been educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. And that's how the New American Standard puts it. But the Greek word here for learning is actually Sophia, which means wisdom. So as a child, he had been trained up in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians so that he was powerful. The word is dunamis, from which we get our English word dynamite. He was powerful in word and deed. But all the wisdom of the Egyptians that Moses had was not enough to accomplish the plans of God. I think it's kind of ironic because if you think back, all of Israel ended up in Egypt in the first place because Egypt's wise men at that time couldn't interpret Pharaoh's dreams. God used Joseph and his God-given wisdom to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And here again, we see the wisdom of Egypt is lacking. It wasn't enough back then, and it wasn't enough for Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. So Moses' first deliverance attempt failed miserably. And failing does something to people. Failing rarely knocks people back to a proper sense of reality. Failure typically has a pendulum aspect to it. Knocks us not just back to center, but it knocks us oftentimes to another extreme. Maybe not for everyone, but it sure does for me. And I think you see it played out in the life of Moses. He's not knocked back to just a right view. He's knocked off center the other direction. Remember, Acts clearly tells us he was a man of power in words and deeds. But 40 years later, when God calls Moses to go back to Egypt, what's his response? It's essentially, sorry, you've got the wrong guy. I can't talk. And I kind of doubt his assessment of himself. And I doubt it because of the Acts account. Why is it so important to think with a sound mind? I think you see compelling answers in the life of Moses. Overestimation not only leads to failure, it usually leads to underestimation. Now, when the fullness of time comes for God's plan, Moses resists. He's not thinking with sound judgment. The man who we're told was powerful in word and deed suddenly thinks he can't talk. And God, in his grace, moves Moses past his hang-up and he gives him Aaron. But the picture is profound. Moses, who 40 years earlier was going to take on Egypt essentially alone, now resists even when he has a specific word from God. I wish this were the end of the story. Moses overestimates, Moses underestimates, and for the rest of his days, Moses rightly estimates. That would be a wonderful ending, wouldn't it? But the story doesn't end that way. You'll look at the text of Numbers 20 this week in your study time, and we come across a tragic event late in the life of Moses that should be a wake-up call to every follower of Christ who's been at it a long time. Moses has lived amazingly for about the past 40 years, and in the presence of grumblers, which is a hard thing to do. It's hard to be faithful, especially in those circumstances. He has been God's man day in and day out, and just shy of the promised land, his eyes momentarily slip off of God and onto himself and onto the massive grumblers he's been living with all of these years. God commands Moses to speak to the rock to bring water out of it, and instead Moses strikes the rock. The text tells us, he said to the people, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring water forth for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Oh, my heart breaks for Moses. All of those years with all those annoying people, and now to fall short. And yet the more I read the text, the more convinced I become that it was only God's mercy that kept he and Aaron from being struck down on the spot. They were not bringing water forth from the rock. God was bringing water forth from the rock through Moses. Details? Yes, but important details that make all the difference. Now, if you're in a group, spend some time discussing if you're more inclined to over or underestimating yourself. Do you know what your spiritual gift is? If so, how has understanding what your gift or gifts are impacted your ability to think so as to have sound judgment? Finally, how can knowing God better help you in having sound judgment about yourself and others? Before you wrap up, post your response to any or all of these questions or any other takeaway that God has been impressing on you this week. Thinking rightly about ourselves is a big deal. As my friend Jan Silvius often says, there is a God and you are not him. But my friend, we are known by him and we can know him. And with this God, all things are possible. This week, let's live in that truth, thinking rightly about ourselves because of what we know about our God.